Our team at RMSO enjoys investigating and searching for Bigfoot in Washington, including the Mount St. Helens area because of the long history of Bigfoot sightings and encounters in the area. And this type of activity is still reported almost every single year to this day. The 1924 Ape Canyon Bigfoot attack on the southeast side of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington has always been an intriguing event because my grandfather had 3 Bigfoot walk up to him during the daytime while he was fishing at a remote lake on the Mount St. Helens around 1937. My grandfather had no idea what these 3 giant hair-covered humanoid creatures were until the famous Patterson video was shown in theaters of a large female Bigfoot captured on video October 20th, 1967 in the Bluff Creek area of North California. It was then that he was able to coin the name Bigfoot to the creature or 3 creatures that walked up to him. Please hit the like button, subscribe, and smash that bell button to turn on all notifications so you won't miss the 2 or more videos we post each week. Fred Beck came forward and stated that he fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens in Washington. Fred was of a party of 5 miners attacked by these mysterious creatures. The event was written about in local and national newspapers. 43 years later, Fred Beck from Kelso, Washington, sat down with his son Ronald A. Beck and wrote about his experience on September 27th, 1967. Here is an overview of what happened on July of 1924 when the hairy apes attacked their cabin. They had been prospecting for the last 6 years in the St. Helens and Lewis River areas of southwest Washington. Once in a while they would come across large humanoid-like tracks by the creek beds and springs. In 1924, Fred and 4 other miners were working their gold claim called the Vander White. It was near a deep canyon on the east side of St. Helens that is presently named Ape Canyon. It got its name after the incident that became famous in newspapers, books, and documentaries. One of the miners, Fred, is going to call Hank in order to keep him and his family anonymous. And Hank was concerned about the large humanoid-like tracks they kept finding because he knew no animal could have made them. The largest measured 19 inches long. During the middle of July, their gold mine tested positively from a technician or an assay. Everyone was excited. Fred had an aching tooth and asked Hank to take him to town to see a dentist. However, Hank was so excited about the test on the mine, he stated that God nor the devil could take him away from that mine. Everyone had come up the trailhead in Hank's Ford, so no way for Fred to get to town unless Hank took him. The miners had been hearing noises every evening over the past week. They heard peculiar, shrill whistling. It would come from a ridge and then from another ridge, as if they were communicating with each other. They would also hear a booming and thumping sound, as if something was hitting itself on the chest. Hank and Fred on one occasion went to the spring around 100 yards from the miner's cabin to get some water and decided it was best to take their rifles just to be on the safe side. During the hike to the spring, Hank raised his rifle and yelled. At that instant, Fred saw a hairy creature around 100 yards away standing next to a pine tree. It hid behind the tree and kept poking its head from side to side of the tree, observing the 2 hikers. Hank shot, making the bark from the tree fly, shooting a total of 3 times and hitting the tree each time. Fred stated that 100 yards seems a long ways away to see bark fly from the shot, but it is what he saw. He estimated the creature to be about 7 feet tall with dark brown hair. It then disappeared from view for a short time, then they saw it again running fast and upright down the canyon. Fred then shot at it 3 times before it disappeared from view. They took water back to the cabin and explained the encounter with the rest of the miners. They all agreed, including Hank, to go home the next day because it was getting too dark to get to the car that day. The party agreed it would not be wise to hike out in the dark. The party retired to the pine log cabin that they had built themselves. It was very sturdy and stood for many years afterward. It was visited by many sightseers for several years. The cabin had a long bunk bed for 2 men. The rest of the miners slept on top of pine boughs laid on the floor. The cabin had a stone fireplace, and there were no windows built into the cabin. After the men retired to the cabin, they sat around smoking tobacco pipes and discussing the trip home planned for the next day. After the miners fell asleep in their crude beds, they were all awakened around midnight. Hank was sleeping on the floor and started yelling and kicking. However, the noise that awakened the miners was a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. It hit so hard that some of the chinking was knocked loose from between the logs and fell into Hank's chest. He had a rifle in his hands, waving it around, and he kicked and yelled. He always slept with his Remington nearby. The miners heard a loud commotion outside, like many feet trampling and rattling over shakes of wood. The rest of the miners armed themselves, and Hank looked through a space left by the chinking knocked loose. They all could see the three creatures outside through the spaces in the logs. It sounded like there were many more. This was the beginning of the famous attack so many have written about in the Washington, Oregon newspapers over the years. Most newspaper accounts tell of giant boulders being hurled against the cabin. Some say they fell through the roof. However, that was not the case. There were a few large rocks around the area. It's true that many smaller ones were hurled at the cabin. However, they did not break through the roof, but did hit with loud bangs and rolled off. Some came through the chimney of the fireplace. The only time shots were fired that night was when the creatures were attacking the cabin. When they would quiet down and stop the attack for a few minutes, the miners would also stop firing. Fred told the rest of the men that maybe they would realize when they stopped the attack, the men would also stop too. They then would realize they were only doing it in defense. Several times the men had a line of sight at the creatures through the logs and chose not to because they weren't attacking. When they started up the attack again and climbed up on the roof, the miners fired through the roof. They had to brace the thick log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed because the creatures kept pushing against it, and the entire door vibrated from the impact. They responded by firing several rounds through the door. They also pushed against the walls of the cabin as if they were trying to push the cabin over, which was impossible because the cabin was so sturdily made. Hank fired the most shots, and the rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin. Everyone seemed stunned and incredulous. The attack continued for the remainder of the night. There were brief intervals between attacks. One of the most frightening moments was when one of the creatures reached an arm through the chinking space and grabbed an axe by the handle. Before the creature could pull the axe out, Fred turned the head of the axe upright so it could not fit between the logs and it got stuck. The creature finally let go of the axe and Fred safely pulled the handle back into the cabin, then put it in a place that he did not think the creature could reach. Fred recalls Hank almost singing, "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll all go home in the morning." Hank hoped the mountain devils, as he called them, might understand and go away. The attack ended just before sunrise. As soon as there was enough light to see, the miners then came cautiously out of the cabin. Not long after, Fred saw one of the ape-like creatures standing about 80 yards away near the edge of Ape Canyon. He fired 3 times and it toppled over the cliff and down into the gorge. The miners abandoned their supplies and equipment and took only what they could fit in their packs, leaving behind expensive supplies like drilling equipment and powder. The group agreed to keep what happened to themselves. However, that didn't last long. They made their way to Spirit Lake, and at the ranger station, Hank reported the Bigfoot tracks that they had found. The ranger responded, "Let me know if you find out what they are." Hank then explained what made them, to the puzzlement of the ranger. When the men made their way back home to the town of Kelso, Washington, they told some friends, and somehow the story leaked to the newspapers, and the Great Hairy Ape Hunt of 1924 was on. Local reporters interviewed the men. After that, many people flocked to the Mount St. Helens area looking for the mountain devils or the great hairy apes. Investigators and detectives found large Bigfoot-shaped tracks. This is Kelly from RMSO responding. In my personal opinion, I doubt these creatures would have attacked these men in their miner cabin if they had not attacked them first. Hank and Fred firing several shots each at one that hid behind the tree that was observing them and then running away was an ill-advised move. My grandfather's experience over a decade later around the 1937 in Mount St. Helens area, where 3 Sasquatch walked up on him while he was fishing from around 20 yards away. Then 3 out of the 4 other young men camping with him saw the same 3 Bigfoot goes to show that they more than likely won't harm you if you don't try to harm them. My grandfather and his backpacking group did not stick around after their encounter with the creatures. They immediately packed up and hiked out, never to return to that location again. But if the Bigfoot wanted to hurt them, they had an obvious opportunity to do so. Live and let live. Hope you all enjoyed a look around the Mount St. Helens area while I went over the famous Bigfoot event with you all. Keep on watching. We're going to keep on squatching.